the new explosive reports about Trump's extraordinary effort to bypass procedures, defy regulations, and even break laws as he tries to build his long-promised border wall. The Washington Post first reporting Trump has, quote, directed aides to fast-track billions of dollars worth of construction contracts, aggressively seize private land, and disregard environmental rules, telling them to, quote, take the land, and then assuring worried aides, quote, don't worry, I will pardon you. A White House official telling the Post Trump is joking when he makes these remarks. But today, the New York Times matching the Post's reporting. The Post also reporting that Trump has told aides that a failure to deliver on this promise of his 2016 campaign would be a letdown to his supporters and an embarrassing defeat. And one thing is true. Not a single mile of new border wall has been built since Trump took office. Even while Trump publicly touts progress on the wall, it has yet to happen.
We're going to have the wall. We've already started building it. We have $1.6 billion. We've started building it. We started building our wall. I'm so proud of it. We started. We have $1.6 billion. And we've already started. We're building a lot of wall. We're going to show you a section, and a lot of things are happening.
All right, joining me now is Danielle Belton, editor-in-chief of The Root, Nicholas Confessori, political reporter for The New York Times, Juanita Tolliver, director of campaigns at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Great to have all of you with us. Danielle, let me begin with you, first of all. Is this a joking matter? I mean, the president, you know, the aides are coming out and dismissing this as a joking matter. But when you look at the surface of what the president of the United States is apparently ordering his subordinates to do, break the law, seize the land, get this wall done by any means necessary.
I know I would always make a joke to tell my staff to commit crimes. Yes, that's a hilarious joke. It's terrible. That's not good at all. This is an increasingly unserious president in an increasingly serious time. It's extremely disturbing that someone who is supposed to help uphold the law, be an example of the law, enforce the law as president of the United States would make well, I don't think he was joking. I mean, one, to be honest. But if he was joking, how is that appropriate? Clearly, he just wants this wall built just to appease his base, which is disgusting.
Nick, give me your thoughts on this. Trump telling his own aides to break the law, as we outlined there, and then aides coming out trying to spin this as a joking matter.
Well, look, the Trump wall is a classic Trump project, right? He's oversold it. He's marketed the heck out of it, but he hasn't actually built it yet, and he can't find the money for it yet. And so he's in a pinch. Everyone's watching what he'll do. I think when I hear him say, I'm just joking, it sounds like the kind of joking that isn't really joking. Where you make the joke to see what people actually do with the joke. And then you can say, I wasn't joking. Really, go do it.
Yeah, with a wink and a nod.
Yeah, and look, like his history on pardons, you know, it puts us in a place to not give him the benefit of the doubt that he's joking on this. He has always viewed pardons as a purely political instrument. He's had them in the past. And I'm not surprised if it happens again in the future.
Juanita, to that point, given what Nick just said, how important this wall has been to the president's entire campaign, I can't think of any other rally cry, if you will, besides lock her up and build the wall that defined the Trump presidency. What is at risk for President Trump in 2020 if he does not get this wall started and constructed?
I mean, everything is at risk for Trump if he does not get this wall. This is honestly the one campaign promise that he's really pushing for now, and he's extremely desperate to deliver on it, because what you have juxtaposed to this is an economy that is trending negatively. You have his trade war that is exacerbating the economic issues that Americans are facing right now, and so this is what he's leaning on. So not only is this illegal, but it reeks of desperation because he has nothing but a laundry list of broken promises. And now with his back against the wall, he knows he has to do something to show voters, show Americans that he has delivered on any one of his bad promises.
I want to play for you guys what senior Trump campaign official Mark Lauder told Ari on the beat just this summer. Watch this.
Mexico is paying a lot for our southern security, and that I would call it a virtual wall.
That's your closing argument. They're paying for a virtual wall.
They are paying for a virtual wall. I'm not even sure what that means. Let me start with you, Danielle. Is that a legitimate argument? Can you have what Mark Lauder was saying there, a virtual wall that Mexico is paying for?
No. Mexico's not paying for a wall. There's no wall.
A, Mexico's not paying for it. B, I don't know what a virtual wall is.
What is that?
What is a virtual wall?
Is it invisible? I mean, everything about this wall is preposterous that comes out of Trump's mouth. Like the fact that, they want to spend another 70 to 133 million to paint it black because black absorbs heat and would make the wall hot, which would make it harder to climb. Why don't we build a moat too and put sharks in it with lasers on their heads that shoot bees out of their mouths? Like, what are we talking about right now?
It seems somewhat absurd, but Nick, when you hear the administration come out and they know what's at risk because this was such a cornerstone of the president's political campaign in 2016, Mark Lauder and others, the president is, he's either lying about the fact that the wall has been constructed or he's simply misstating the truth that nothing has been built about it. But then you have Mark Lauder going on saying this is a virtual wall.
Well, what's striking about it is the dissonance between the private panic, we have to get it built, we have to get it built, and the public message. Their campaign is already saying, promise kept. We built the wall, here's a clip. Right? So I'm not sure what they're actually afraid of. He's obviously going to run on the promise being kept, regardless of how many new walls are built or kind of miles are built. I do think the virtual wall is not a totally absurd argument. What he's referring to there, obviously, is surveillance challenge, technology, other things. But look,
like a smart border, which is what Democrats
already had. Yeah. By the way, what makes us all so strange. We had a wall, we still have a wall. So he campaigned on claiming there was no wall, and now he's campaigning on building a wall that he hasn't built, even though one is already actually there. It just messes my mind up a little bit.
How, when you think about this, Juanita, for a moment, that the Republican Party is the party, or at least this president, I should be clear, this president is the one making the argument into seizing land from American landowners to build this wall. That's certainly not something that you would expect would be part of a Republican platform, but he wants to make it.
I mean, it's incredulous. First and foremost, you have the president of the country saying, like, just commit a crime. And then let's be real about how triggering that just seize the land language is, considering the just horrific treatment of Native Americans and tribal communities in our country. So it just harkens back to language and rhetoric that he is driving home. But repeating that there is a wall is not a ridiculous ploy in this case, because let's be real, some Trump voters will probably accept that there was something done here, even though the 60 miles of wall that have been modified during the 2.5 years of Trump's presidency are just reinforcing existing structures. But he hasn't done anything. Not a single mile of wall has been built here.
Let me dig into that a little bit deeper. The suggestion that Trump is telling his aides that they should seize private land. It is the idea of eminent domain, the government taking property from private landowners for a project and paying out some money in return. Trump's primary opponents hit him for taking that approach in business. In fact, he famously tried to do it in Atlantic City and lost to this woman who actually got to keep her home.
Heart? He doesn't have no heart, that man. The only thing he has is what he's worried about himself.
All right, I want to bring in Bill Kristol, conservative journalist and former Republican White House aide, now director of the group Defending Democracy Together. Bill, good to have you on with us this evening. First of all, give me your response to Trump telling aides to take the land.
Look, I mean, we should take this seriously. It's really about more than the wall. It's about more than lying about the wall. Politicians are entitled to lie. I mean, they should be called on it. But this is ordering subordinates, apparently, to break the law, or at least to consider breaking the law, or to do things that might well be unlawful. I mean, that is really almost the definition of an impeachable offense. A superior officer orders a subordinate officer to knowingly and consciously do something that's against the law. So for me, this is about the rule of law much more than about the wall. And the pardons, of course, makes it even worse. If the president wants to put this to bed, here's one thing he could do. He could say he's not going to pardon anyone who's worked in his White House. Take that issue off the table. Say that publicly. Reassure people that we're not in a situation where he's ordering people to do something unlawful, which, again, is, if you look at Richard Nixon's impeachment articles, one of the articles, I think it's Section 5 of Article 2, is he knowingly ordered people, his subordinates, to break the law. So that's really what this is about. And I think it's a mistake, in a way, to get too distracted. You know, the wall is silly, and he's misleading people about how many miles there are and all that. But that's, in a way, politics. That's normal politics. He's president of the United States, and he now seems to be using the combination of bullying his subordinates and the promise of pardons to get the U.S. government to use government authority to do unlawful acts.
So are you expecting at this point, given what has transpired in terms of the news reports about this, that you're going to see fellow colleagues of yours from the GOP stand up and draw a red line for the president about the pardons, about breaking law, about the eminent domain? What do you expect their reaction to be, and should there be investigations into this account?
Yeah, I think it's perfectly legitimate to look into. There are congressional committees. I don't expect much of the Republicans, but I hope the House, really, under Democratic leadership, really looks closely into this and calls officials from the relevant agencies and say, has the president ordered you directly or indirectly to break the law? Justify what you're doing here when you're building this wall or using eminent domain. Eminent domain is something conservatives, a lot of liberals don't like much either, but there are ways to legally use eminent domain. Governments do it all the time. There are restrictions, there are procedures you have to go through. If he's shortcutting those procedures, knowingly, again, violating existing rules, regulations, and laws, that's something to look into. Having said all that, yeah, I don't have great confidence that the Republican Party in Congress is going to stand up. It's really pathetic. I have seen that some of the challengers to Trump in the Republican primary, Joe Walsh and Bill Weld, have denounced this and said the core of how our system works is the president has to faithfully see that the laws are faithfully executed.
The list of investigations into this presidency continues. Danielle, do you think this should be added on there, that this president should be investigated for possibly telling his subordinates, break the law, seize the land?
Yes, most definitely. I mean, the fact that he would even say this, and given the implication of his level of power because of who he is and the office that he holds, to sit there and make what his aides are trying to pass off as a joke about essentially ordering them to break the law in order to build a wall as part of his campaign promise is unconscionable.
And to that point, Juanita, the investigations that we're talking about here, they continue to grow by the day. But realistically speaking, as Bill was saying, the GOP is going to probably be pretty silent on this.
Yeah, of course. I think that they are falling in line behind Trump and honestly taking this vow of silence against anything this president does throughout the 2020 election. I'm not expecting anything from the GOP, but I do think it is incumbent upon Congress to ask the question, do a little digging here, try to get to the truth.
Yeah, let me play you guys a mashup of some Republicans talking about eminent domain. Watch this.
Eminent domain, fancy term for politicians seizing private property to enrich the fat cats who bankroll them, like Trump.
He supports taking private property through eminent domain from small property owners and giving it to big corporations. I don't know of one conservative in America who supports that abuse of eminent domain.
What Donald Trump did was use eminent domain to try to take the property of an elderly woman on the Strip in Atlantic City.
So, Nick, when you look at that, and this was all from the 2016 campaign, you look at what the president is doing today, the silence of the GOP, it is safe to say he has totally redefined the Republican Party, not just on this issue, but so many others.
Look, you saw how powerful that argument was in 2016. It wasn't powerful at all.
Right.
Nobody cared in that primary. He won the election. But look, I think what we see here over and over again is that people in his party will wait and try to wait as long as they can for the worst things to actually come to fruition. And a lot of them are going to say, look, this is something he said, it hasn't actually happened yet. And people just want to wait out the problem as long as they can in his party.
So, Bill, to that point, in 2020, if in fact President Trump fails to build a single mile of new wall, how damaging will it be to him politically, or is he just going to stand up there and lie about it to the cameras and say it's actually being built and people and his followers are just going to believe it?
Yeah, I think he can say it's being built, or he can say that he's being stopped by Nancy Pelosi or the courts or the fake news media or anything like that. Actually, that's what's so funny about this. I mean, I don't know that there's much evidence that votes move one way or the other on how much of the wall is being built. He's obsessed with it. But again, it seems to me if I were a Democrat, but also the Republicans challenging Trump, and if there were any Republican elected officials who wanted to stand up for the principle of the rule of law, this is the moment to say, hey, look, we all have policy goals. We all have campaign promises. Presidents have that. But that you cannot order subordinates knowingly to violate the law.
Yeah, I have a feeling that we're probably not going to hear a lot about it from other GOP members this week. Danielle Belton, Nicholas Confessori, Bill Kristol, thank you very much.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.